It's amazing how some historical periods and events,
Mm.
they can still spark debate even now, a century or more later.
Yeah, it's true.
We've been seeing a lot of that recently at ACN.
Yeah.
With our deep dive into Chapter 12 of Arkansas and Narrative History, we've been covering that a lot.
Right.
We've been releasing an essay every day now on this chapter for going on 10 days or so.
Yeah.
And it seems like some of the things that happened back then are still very much alive in the minds and conversations, particularly in Ashley County. Like, it's still a hot button issue.
Yeah.
And it just makes you think, what is it about this period that continues to resonate so strongly?
Well, and that's exactly where our focus is today. We're going to be taking a deep dive into this era in Arkansas, this period of significant change and growth. And I think, as you mentioned, with the extensive coverage that Chapter 12 has received recently, it's clear that this period has a lot to teach us. It offers insights into how Arkansas became what it is today.
Yeah. Going through this material, it's like a time machine back to Arkansas between 1900 and 1920. And it was the era of progressive reform. But it wasn't happening in isolation. Arkansas had its own unique identity, its Southern heritage, a history very much shaped by racial dynamics, a very limited approach to taxation, and frankly, a rather fragile economy.
Yeah.
So you get this sense of a state trying to move forward, trying to embrace progress, but also having to deal with these pre-existing conditions that were very real and very present.
Right. And I think what's fascinating is that we have this national progressive movement,
Right.
this push for order, efficiency in response to industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of these huge corporations.
Yeah.
But in Arkansas, we see those same concerns, but they're operating within a society that's still structured by this really rigid racial hierarchy.
Right.
And of course, Arkansas still had a predominantly rural population. So you might have efforts to improve public health or to regulate railroads, but those often existed alongside laws and practices that were specifically designed to disenfranchise and marginalize African Americans.
Yeah. It's like progress, but with these huge caveats, right? It's not this straightforward advancement for everyone. You see how some reforms, even if the goal was improvement in one area, could have these really negative and really repressive impacts on others, especially when it comes to voting rights.
Absolutely. In the early 20th century, you saw this strengthening of measures specifically designed to limit Black political participation. The white primary, solidified in 1906 by a state law, essentially barred Black men from having any meaningful participation in the Democratic Party, which, as you know, was the dominant, basically the only political force in the state at the time. And of course, this was layered on top of things like the poll tax, which had been around for a while, but they just further restricted voting along racial and economic lines.
So that really sets the scene then for the emergence of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909. And it was a direct response to this rising tide of racism. But the source material mentions that its growth in the South, particularly in the early years, was actually quite slow. What factors contributed to that?
Well, one of the really interesting things here is the influence of Booker T. Washington,
Oh.
who was, at the time, a very, very prominent Black leader who was advocating for a more gradual approach to racial progress. He emphasized economic self-reliance, vocational training, and he really pushed for accommodation within the existing racial framework as opposed to direct political confrontation. And so his philosophy really differed quite a bit from the NAACP's more, I guess you could say, assertive agenda, which was to challenge segregation head on and fight for equal rights through legal and political means.
Right. And so for many Black individuals and communities in the South, there was this understandable fear of retaliation, economic retaliation, social ostracism, if they openly aligned with the NAACP, which at the time was seen as this, well, more radical organization.
Right, exactly. There were very real risks involved.
Yeah. But then, in 1918, we see the establishment of the Little Rock chapter of the NAACP.
Yeah.
Sounds like a significant step forward.
Yeah, and it really was a landmark event.
Yeah.
Some prominent Black professionals and businessmen in Little Rock founded the chapter, people like the sons of Johnny Bush of the Mosaic Templars, figures like Dr. John M. Robinson, folks who are very established in Little Rock society. However, what's interesting to note is that initially, this chapter functioned more like a social and civic organization, particularly for the Black elite in Little Rock. And the source suggests that this group had achieved a certain level of comfort and stability in Little Rock.
Yeah.
The city still had some of that frontier character. They lived in more integrated neighborhoods compared to other parts of the South, and they had certain economic advantages. And many among them had adopted this more accommodationist approach, so they were perhaps less inclined to engage in aggressive activism that might disrupt their, relatively secure position.
So it's a chapter of the NAACP, but not necessarily one that's immediately focused on, you know, shaking things up, directly challenging the status quo. That's a very interesting nuance.
Right.
And all this is happening while poor black and white Arkansans are finding work in these expanding railroad and lumber industries. So how did that fit into this whole idea of progressive reform?
Well, if we look at the bigger picture of Arkansas's development, the growth of these industries brought about significant economic changes, but the impact was often very uneven. And it was very much intertwined with existing social and racial structures. So, for example, in the Delta region of eastern Arkansas, the clearing of these vast forests and the creation of these drainage districts, which were often seen as progressive steps toward modernizing agriculture, actually led to the plantation system becoming even more entrenched. So yeah, large-scale cotton farming dominated. And this brought wealth to certain landowners, but it came at a really significant environmental cost. You had the destruction of vital wetlands, wildlife habitats, and it also just reinforced this very exploitative system of labor, particularly for black sharecroppers.
Right. And the impact of the railroad and lumber industries, it wasn't uniform across the state, was it? I mean, the source mentions how it really depended on the fertility of the land.
Absolutely. So in the fertile lowlands of eastern Arkansas, you had this land cleared of timber that was really prime for agriculture. And that really drove that expansion of the plantation economy. But then you go to the more rugged terrain of the Washita Mountains in western Arkansas, and the soil there wasn't as fertile, so there wasn't the same economic incentive to convert those forests into farmland.
Yeah.
And that, coupled with a growing awareness at the time about conservation, actually led to a more positive environmental outcome. So in 1907, the Arkansas National Forest was established, which was later renamed the Waukita National Forest, but it was actually the very first national forest in the South.
Wow.
So it's kind of a surprising twist. You have less productive land that inadvertently contributes to these conservation efforts.
Yeah, so you have one part of the state focus on draining wetlands for agriculture, and another part setting aside forests for preservation. Really shows the different sides of this progressive coin.
Definitely.
Now, the chapter introduces us to some key political figures, and let's start with Jeff Davis.
Oh, Jeff Davis.
He's described as an early progressive governor, elected in 1901,
Yeah.
focused on things like prohibition and what they called trust busting, which was basically breaking up these big corporations that were seen as unfairly controlling the markets.
Right.
But he's also described as someone who used racial demagoguery. That's quite a contradiction.
Well, and I think this is what makes these figures from history so fascinating, right? Davis definitely tapped into some populist and progressive themes.
Yeah.
He advocated for prohibition early in his career. He presented himself as this champion of the common farmer, battling against powerful corporate interests. And he even had some initial concerns about the abuses of the convict leasing system,
Yeah.
which, as you know, was where prisoners, overwhelmingly Black men, were essentially rented out for labor under just horrific conditions.
Yeah.
And this created this perverse incentive for, harsh sentencing and just really exploitation of these prisoners. However, Davis was also a notorious race baiter. He would use this really inflammatory, divisive rhetoric to appeal to white voters.
Right.
And even his stance on prohibition shifted over time, really due to political pressure. So his governorship is really marked by these stark contradictions.
Wow.
He was railing against elites, but at the same time upholding and exploiting racial prejudice.
It's interesting, too, because it was under his governorship that you see both the implementation of the white primary in 1906 and the reaffirmation of the poll tax.
Yes.
Which really underscores the limits of his progressivism.
Oh,
right?
fidelity.
It definitely wasn't progressive for a large segment of the population.
Yeah.
The source also mentions this failed attempt to actually segregate school taxes. What was the thinking behind that?
So this proposal was basically to stipulate that taxes paid by Black citizens could only go to fund Black schools.
Oh, wow.
It was a pretty transparent attempt to cripple Black education.
Yeah.
Given the widespread economic disenfranchisement of Black artisans at the time, they paid very little in taxes, which meant that Black schools would have received a pittance. And Davis is actually quoted as saying that educating Black people just ruined good agricultural laborers.
Oh, my goodness.
Which really reveals the depth of racism that permeated even some of these supposedly progressive political agendas. What's interesting, though, is that even the majority white legislature at the time, even many who supported Davis, actually rejected this particular proposal.
Okay.
So it was a step too far even for them.
So even within his own political base, there was a line.
There you go.
Wow. After Davis, we see Governors Little and Pindall. And Pindall is noted for passing a pure food and drug law. That sounds like a more straightforward, I guess, progressive achievement, something that's more in line with the national efforts to regulate product safety.
Yeah, it definitely was. And Pindall's time as acting governor was pretty short, but he did see this passage of this important legislation, which was part of a broader national concern with the safety and the labeling of food and medicinal products. He also enacted some other measures that were aligned with progressive ideals, such as, imposing a franchise tax on out-of-state corporations. He tried to prevent these discriminatory pricing practices, but serving in just an interim capacity, obviously, limited his ability to achieve, more widespread reforms.
Yeah. Right. Then comes George Washington Donaghy, who seems to be considered a more consistent, more truly progressive governor. He served from 1909 to 1913. What were some of the key accomplishments that really set him apart?
Yeah, so Donaghy is generally considered a more genuine progressive figure, especially within this context of the early 20th century South. He really spearheaded significant efforts to reform the state's tax system, which was very regressive at the time.
Yeah.
He wanted to provide greater support for public education, public health initiatives, and crucially, he successfully advocated for the adoption of the initiative in referendum.
Oh, right.
Which empowered citizens with this more direct role in the legislative process.
Yeah.
He even enlisted William Jennings Bryan to campaign for these democratic reforms in Arkansas.
Wow.
But perhaps his most notable and enduring achievement was his successful campaign to finally abolish the convict leasing system.
Yes. Convict leasing. And the source really does not hold back in describing the horrific conditions under which these prisoners were forced to work. What was Donaghy's personal involvement in all of this? And what obstacles did he have to overcome to actually end it?
So Donaghy had firsthand knowledge of the abuses in convict leasing because he actually worked on construction projects, including early work on the state capitol that utilized convict labor.
Oh, wow.
And he was personally just revolted by what he saw, the inhumane treatment, inadequate food and shelter, the excessive labor demands, and the really alarming mortality rates, particularly among the Black convict population. But of course, he faced tremendous resistance. There were powerful interests who were profiting from this cheap labor source. And there was concern even within the Democratic establishment about the financial implications of the state now having to assume responsibility for, caring for all these prisoners. But despite this opposition, Donaghy really remained steadfast in his opposition to convict leasing. And in 1912, he took this really bold step. He issued mass pardons to a large number of convicts.
Oh, wow.
Which essentially made the leasing system unworkable. It was a really courageous action. And it's worth noting that this built on earlier expressions of concern about convict leasing from some previous governors like James H. Barry and James P. Eagle. And even Jeff Davis had condemned it earlier, although he ultimately failed to dismantle it.
So it seems like Donaghy really was a force for good in that particular area. That's a really, I think, powerful example of genuine progressive action. Next, we have Joseph T. Robinson, whose governorship was very brief, but apparently still impactful. What did he manage to accomplish in that short time?
So Robinson actually started out aligned with that, what they called the old Jeff Davis machine.
Oh,
But during his very short time as governor, which was less than 2 months, he established a surprisingly strong progressive record.
Wow.
He oversaw the enactment of a Corrupt Practices Act, which was designed to increase transparency in elections. And he also established 3 really important state agencies: the State Banking Department to regulate financial institutions, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics to address worker welfare, and the State Highway Commission to start addressing the desperate need for better infrastructure in Arkansas.
So those are all very much in line with that progressive movement.
Very much so.
It's interesting that even a figure emerging from a less, let's say, progressive faction could still embrace these types of reforms.
Yeah, it's an interesting I guess you could say, contradiction. But it does suggest that there was this broader appeal to some of these progressive ideas.
Right. And his quick move to the Senate perhaps was facilitated by those initial alliances.
Yeah, that's probably true.
The source also mentions some pretty intense political infighting within the Democratic Party during this time. What were the main issues that were causing these divisions?
Well, in the one-party South, the real battles for political power happened within the Democratic primary.
Right.
So Jeff Davis's Senate career had proven to be somewhat lackluster and pretty controversial, really marked by, well, his characteristic bombastic style. But also he was frequently absent. And on top of that, his populist image really took a hit due to his involvement in this really complex legal dispute over what they called the Sunk Lands in northeast Arkansas. He was representing the St. Francis Levee district, which stood to gain by selling off these lands to lumber companies and speculators. But this would potentially displace hundreds of small homesteaders.
So in a way, he's seen as siding with these big business interests against the common man.
Exactly.
That's a big blow to his image.
It really was. And his public criticism of these homesteaders during some hearings really tarnished that reputation.
That definitely created an opening for someone like Stephen Brundage to challenge him.
Exactly.
Brundage, former congressman with a more moderate progressive platform.
Yes, and he presented a very serious challenge to Davis in that Senate race. The election was extremely close, and there were a lot of credible allegations of fraud and irregularities. Many people believed that Brundage was actually the rightful winner. And then he later ran for governor against George Hayes, who was a Davis ally, and again faced similar problems with disputed election results in Phillips County. So all of this really highlights how contentious and, frankly, how messy politics were at the time.
So those elections really show the lengths that some people would go to in order to maintain or grab power. And George Hayes, as governor from 1913 to 1917, what were his main priorities? The Alexander Road Improvement Act seems to be a key piece of legislation from his time in office.
So Hayes, while perhaps more focused on consolidating his own political power, he did preside over some notable reforms. The Alexander Road Improvement Act of 1915 was a really significant initiative that allowed counties to establish these local road improvement districts, and they could issue bonds to fund road construction. And while this spurred a period of road building, it also created a very decentralized and often inefficient system that was prone to mismanagement and even corruption in some cases due to a lack of strong state oversight.
Right.
His administration did enact other progressive measures like moving state elections to the general election in November and passing some legislation aimed at protecting investors from fraudulent schemes. But the Road Improvement Act stands out as a really significant piece of legislation from that era.
And during Hayes's governorship, we also see the passage of this 9-hour workday law for women. Was this viewed as a purely positive development for working women at the time?
Well, it's more nuanced than it might appear at first glance. Some people certainly viewed it as a protective measure
Right.
to limit the hours that women could be forced to work.
Right.
But others argued that it was discriminatory. They thought that it could actually limit women's employment opportunities because it made them less attractive hires than men who could work those longer hours. But regardless of how you interpret it, it does show that there was this growing awareness of labor conditions and the beginning of these legislative efforts to regulate working hours, but it was very much focused on women,
Right.
which reflects the prevailing social views about, I guess you could say, women's roles and vulnerabilities at the time.
Right. Now, let's talk a bit more about the activism of women during this period. The source really highlights this increasing organization of women and their pursuit of various reforms. What were some of their primary goals and notable achievements?
Women really did play a vital role in advocating for so many of the progressive reforms of this era.
Yeah.
And they did this through literary societies, women's clubs, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, was really a powerhouse. They successfully lobbied for some legislative changes, like granting property rights to married women.
Okay.
The women's suffrage movement also saw a resurgence in Arkansas starting around 1911, and the suffragists kind of strategically focused on trying to gain the right to vote in those primary elections. They aligned themselves with the more, moderate tactics of the American Woman Suffrage Association.
Right.
And all of these efforts really paid off in 1917 when Arkansas became the very first southern state to grant women the right to vote in primary elections.
That's a huge step.
It was. And then they really played this crucial role in the national push for the 19th Amendment, which was, of course, granting women the right to vote. vote nationwide.
Right.
They successfully lobbied for the ratification of the 19th Amendment by Arkansas in 1919, making it the 12th state to do so.
Wow, so a series of victories for women's rights. And the source also mentions their deep involvement in the Prohibition movement.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Women, particularly through the WCTU, they were a powerful and effective force in the Prohibition movement.
Yeah.
They really understood the impact of alcohol on families and communities. And so they organized at the local level. Their efforts, their moral authority, these were key factors in building support for Prohibition. And while the Anti-Saloon League had, a political role, it was really that persistent organizing and advocacy of women that provided the driving force behind the Bone Dry Law, which was passed in Arkansas in 1915, which Governor Brough strongly supported.
Okay.
I'll also note that, the Going Amendment, which actually tried to make it harder to shut down existing saloons by restricting who could sign petitions, it really shows the complexity of the Prohibition debate.
Yeah. It's fascinating to see women really making these strides in the public sphere, even before they achieve full suffrage in all elections. But the source also shares the story of Ida Jo Brooks, who aspired to be in the medical field. And that story seems to be a real reminder of the limitations that women still faced, despite these broader movements and this activism.
Yeah. Her story is really powerful because it shows how these gender barriers were still so strong, especially in professional fields.
Yeah.
And even though she was clearly academically qualified and she really wanted to serve, in the medical profession, she was denied admission to the University of Arkansas Medical School just because she was a woman.
So she had to leave the state.
She had to leave the state
Wow.
to pursue her medical education, which is just,
Amazing.
it's just really striking. But then even after she comes back to Arkansas, gets a position at the medical school, she later faces another obstacle when she tries to run for state superintendent of education. Again, just because she's a woman.
Oh, my goodness.
It's a reminder of that ongoing struggle against these limitations.
Yeah.
But her story also foreshadows the eventual entry of more women into professional and political life in Arkansas. And shortly after her, this disappointment with the state superintendent race, we do start seeing women being elected to various offices around the state.
Okay, so things are changing.
They are, slowly, but they are.
Yeah. And beyond these, more prominent examples of activism and breaking down barriers, what were some of the broader trends in the lives of women during this period?
For the majority of women, their lives still very much revolved around their families, their churches, and often their involvement in local schools. These were all seen as, part of that traditional women's sphere. And given how rural Arkansas was and the limited transportation options, organizations like literary clubs and other groups that had this broader reach, they just didn't have as much of an impact in a lot of these communities. But the increasing availability of newspapers and magazines, it did give women in even remote areas access to new ideas. And while patriarchal structures, remain very much the norm, the idea of the companionate marriage where there was more emphasis on mutual respect, greater autonomy for women within that marital relationship was starting to emerge and gain traction.
Interesting. So shifting gears a little bit to other areas of reform, the source makes this distinction between what it calls negative reforms, like prohibition, and then these positive reforms focused on improvement in areas like education, health, and roads. Let's talk about education first. What are some of the main challenges and the steps taken towards improvement in that area?
Well, as the source describes it, Arkansas's education system at the start of the 20th century was just really disorganized and severely underfunded. There was no central state board of education, teacher training was inadequate, school attendance was low, and you just had all of these tiny, often very poorly equipped school districts with really short terms.
Wow.
And reformers faced, some big hurdles.
Yeah.
One of the biggest being the state's limited tax base. There was a lot of public resistance to raising taxes for education, which you can see in the defeat of the Turner-Jacobson revenue bill, which faced a lot of opposition, even in Ashley County.
Okay.
And there were reasons for this resistance. Wealthy Delta planters, they had their own reasons for not wanting to see increased taxes.
Right.
But poor farmers in the Hill Country also had their concerns. But despite all of this, there was some gradual progress.
Okay.
Efforts focused on establishing county-level supervision for schools, The Arkansas Education Commission was created. They established a state high school board. They worked on improving teacher training through normal schools and summer institutes. They started implementing a standardized graded course of study and even regulating textbook selection.
Wow, so a lot of things were happening.
A lot was happening. But the problem of having too many small, inefficient school districts persisted.
Right.
And of course, you still had this huge disparity in the quality of education between white and black schools, which reflected that deep-seated racial inequality.
That resistance to school taxes,
Yeah.
it really speaks volumes about the priorities of the time.
It does.
What about public health?
Yeah.
What kind of reforms and advancements did that area see?
So public health saw some pretty significant reform efforts, really spurred by the creation of a permanent state board of health in 1913.
Okay.
They also created a Bureau of Vital Statistics to track and analyze health data, which was really important. And there was a spinal meningitis outbreak in Northeast Arkansas in 1913 that really showed how critical it was to have this more robust public health infrastructure.
Yeah.
So the State Board of Health, they started taking on more responsibility. They worked with private and federal agencies on initiatives to combat diseases like hookworm and malaria, which were very prevalent at the time. And they had some really notable successes like the mosquito eradication efforts in Crozet,
Okay.
which significantly reduced malaria transmission. There were also efforts to try to understand and address pellagra. You had improvements in sanitation and water supplies. They implemented vaccination programs against diseases like smallpox. And a tuberculosis sanitarium was founded in Boonville, although initially it only served white patients.
Oh, wow.
So again, you see that racial disparity in access to health care.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And finally, infrastructure. The source talks about this growing popularity of automobiles, but also the terrible state of roads in Arkansas. How do they start to address this challenge?
So the popularity of cars, it created this huge demand for better roads. And so the state legislature passed an act in 1907 that allowed for the creation of these local road improvement districts.
Okay.
They were funded by selling bonds and through local property taxes. And a state highway commission was created in 1913, although its power and resources were quite limited. Then the Alexander Road Improvement Act of 1915, further encouraged the creation of all these local road districts. But this strong emphasis on local control, it resulted in this really fragmented system.
Right.
It was inefficient, there was mismanagement, and even some corruption because there was no central planning.
Yeah.
And when the state finally qualified for federal highway aid in 1917, it did help to spur more road building, but that lack of central planning continued to be a big problem. And then after World War I, that push for road building just intensified, which really highlighted the weaknesses of this approach.
It's fascinating how many of these debates we're talking about, like taxation, local versus state control, the allocation of resources. These issues are still relevant today. We see this even in Ashley County with the resistance back then to that Turner-Jacobson revenue bill.
Exactly. And it reflects this long-standing tension between the need to fund public services and the desire to maintain local autonomy and keep those taxes low.
Yeah. And it's something that probably still resonates in Ashley County and really across the state today.
I would say so.
And similarly, the fact that these reforms had such different impacts on different groups, and particularly the ongoing marginalization of African Americans, it underscores this lasting impact of racial inequality in Arkansas.
Absolutely.
These aren't just events of the past. They've shaped the present in so many ways.
Right, and understanding this history gives us crucial context for understanding the issues that we're facing today.
Exactly. Now, the chapter concludes by looking at World War I and its immediate aftermath. How did the war shape things in Arkansas, especially with regard to this progressive reform movement?
World War I had a big impact, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Governor Bruce strongly supported the war effort, and it led to this heightened sense of patriotism. But unfortunately, it also led to the suppression of dissent. And you see this really clearly in that incident with the Russellites in Cleburne County who resisted the draft. And the war also seemed to shift attention and resources away from a lot of those ongoing progressive reforms. And a proposed new state constitution actually failed in 1918. And tragically, after the war, we saw the horrific Elaine race riot of 1919 in Phillips County.
Yeah.
It was a brutal event that really exposed the deep racial tensions, the continued use of violence and repression, particularly in the Delta region.
That's right.
This violence erupted from efforts by Black sharecroppers to organize for fairer economic settlements through the Farmers and Household Union of America. But those efforts were met with violent resistance from white landowners and authorities.
And it really is a terrible reminder of how progress for some could coexist with just, extreme violence and injustice for others.
It really is. It shows how selective and uneven that progress was in Arkansas, where you had advancements in some areas for some people while others faced just brutal oppression.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what would you say are the key takeaways from this look at the progressive era in Arkansas?
So if we synthesize the main points, I think we see a period marked by this push for reform, right? In education, public health, infrastructure, certain social issues. And women, they really emerged as this powerful force for change during this time.
Yeah.
But their efforts were constrained. You had the state's limited financial resources. You had the deep-seated racial prejudice and discrimination. And you had this strong tradition of local control, which often hindered efficient and equitable implementation of these reforms.
And thinking about all the attention that Chapter 12 has been getting and some of the controversies that it stirred up in Ashley County, what lessons or questions does this period leave us with today?
I think the key takeaway is that a lot of these fundamental tensions and challenges of that era are still with us today.
Right.
Debates about balancing progress and tradition, addressing these persistent inequalities, adequately funding public services, and how to navigate this complex relationship between local and state authority.
It's like history's rhyming, right?
Exactly.
So many of these patterns are repeating themselves.
Right. And when you look at, for instance, the historical resistance to taxation for public goods, it resonates with contemporary discussions about state and local funding priorities.
Yeah.
And the legacy of racial inequality, it continues to shape conversations about justice and opportunity.
So as we close out this deep dive, what's one final thought that you want to leave with our listeners? Something for them to think about.
This period between 1900 and 1920, it was a time of growth for Arkansas. There was a lot of change. But it makes us ask, who really benefited from this progress?
Yeah.
And at what cost to others? Whose voices and experiences might be missing from the traditional narratives of this era? I think exploring the local history of Ashley County during this time would be fascinating. Really digging into the experiences of those diverse communities. I think it could offer some really valuable insights into this complex chapter of Arkansas.